It was 9 p.m. on Friday night, 22nd of October 1920, and the streets of Athlone were full of people. There was no warning of what was about to occur, that those people would soon be in the midst of a reprisal by British forces, and that a civilian named Michael Burke would be shot dead. Before we discuss the reprisal of Friday the 22nd of October, it is necessary to examine the events of earlier that day. Around September 1920, following orders from IRA GHQ and in an attempt to counter the increased activity of the police and military, a flying column was formed from the Athlone Brigade, numbering about 15 men, mostly officers who were on the run. It was led by James Tormey, and the group had only 10 service rifles with about 20 rounds each. Their first major engagement was on the 22nd of October at Parkwood, near Moate. That day, the IRA flying column had ambushed a convoy of black and tans who were being transferred from the main police barracks in Gormanstown, County Meath, to Galway. The flying column succeeded in surprising the convoy, shooting dead one of the Crown forces, an English recruit named Henry Biggs, before escaping in good order. The ambush was over, but that was not the end of the day's violence. About 7:30 p.m, the convoy of black and tans, after being reinforced by 2 lorries of police, 1 lorry of soldiers and an armoured car from Athlone, left Parkwood. The Westmeath Examiner described what happened next. It was on the return journey that the armed forces gave themselves up to an unbridled licence and fired all the way to Athlone and through it until their munitions were exhausted. As they drove through Moate, they fired indiscriminately from their vehicles. An 8-year-old girl was grazed by a bullet, while a woman was shot in the right arm. Members of the convoy directed their fire into shop fronts and domestic residences, shattering windows along the main street. The convoy had entered the town at the same time as the October devotions were concluded, and many people were in the vicinity of St. Patrick's Church. There was a scene of panic as most of the crowd attempted to seek shelter in the church. The Crown forces made their way to Athlone, arriving around 9 p.m. Witnesses described the scene in a report for the Westmeath Independent. The terrible occurrence took place at 9 o'clock when there were many people on the streets, including large numbers of soldiers and officers stationed in the local barracks. Friday night is the night selected by many for their weekly shopping, and consequently, the shops at this hour were doing a brisk business. In the Franciscan Church, the evening devotions in connection with the annual retreat were being held, and in St. Mary's Church, the October devotions were being concluded. There were large congregations in both churches. The town was quite peaceable until the advent of the uniformed men at the time stated. When the lorries arrived at Castlemaine Street, they slackened speed, and immediately a volley of fire and revolver fire rang out. People fled in all directions in a state of panic and took cover in the nearest houses. The firing continued through Irish Town, and loud explosions were distinctly heard in St. Mary's Church. The women and children in the church, in a state of panic, rushed from their places to the altar rails, many of them screaming. Reverend J. Lennon, C.C., who was officiating, counselled the congregation to kneel down and place their trust in God. The firing continued through the streets, and pedestrians fled in all directions for safety. In Church Street, a terrible calamity occurred. Mr. Michael Burke, Urban District Council, a most popular and highly esteemed townsman, when about to cross the street to his house, was struck down. Mr. Burke was stepping off the footpath when the bullet pierced the left side of his head over the ear. When Mr. Burke was seen to fall, a corporal of the Royal Field Artillery and Mr. Leonard, Main Street, ex-soldier, emerged from a house nearby, where they had taken cover, and pluckily, amidst rifle firing, rushed to Mr. Burke's assistance. With the assistance of Mr. T. Sweeney and others, they carried Mr. Burke into the house of Mrs. Farrell, Church Street. In the meantime, indiscriminate firing continued as the lorries proceeded towards the town bridge. The rifles and revolvers blazed, and bullets whizzed in all directions. So ended the newspaper report, a report from a town that had been left terrified and appalled. Burke died a few days later. Michael Burke's death, that reprisal, and the story of the tragic events that followed over subsequent weeks are some of the many stories from Westmeath and the Midlands which are being explored by Westmeath County Council and the historian in residence, Ian Kennelly.
Westmeath Historian in Residence is supported by the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media's Decade of Centenaries programme. Follow Ian Kennelly's blogs on westmeathcoco.ie/Decade of Centenaries. This infomercial is supported by the Creative Ireland programme and Westmeath County Council.